Oh, good morning. The wheels do indeed keep turning. You know, it's Thursday, or what I like to say, Friday Eve. I'm Babz Rawls-Ivy. This is LoveBabz, LoveTalk. So this is day 2 of continuing my conversation about the pandemic, but not just about the symptoms and the health of pandemic, but other things that affect and are affected by this global pandemic. So yesterday I had a wonderful, rich conversation with Dr. Robert Saunders, who is an expert in national security and what the pandemic meant to our national security and to our military and all of that. Today, I'm having the pleasure of talking to Dr. Robert Brown, who is a medical sociologist, educator, and a social justice advocate, whose research and technical assistance services to increase understanding about the social dominance of health equity, and to inform policy. He's also the author of the book Economic Stress, Harsh Truths and Keys to Empowerment, which you can find on economicstresshelp.com. He defines economic stress as the inability of a person or family to meet their financial obligations because of job loss, not enough work, job instability, low wages, and impact on their mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, and economic well-being. So today we're going to talk about, based on his research, Dr. Brown believes that as more groups are being exposed to COVID-19, in addition to existing and significant levels of economic stress since the Great Recession, the likelihood that the overall state of health in society will continue to be adversely impacted. Welcome, Dr. Brown.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's good to be with you.
I know that was a lot to unpack, but I wanted to sort of set the tone a little bit for the conversation. So the pandemic that we are in the midst of, it's not solely about us getting sick of symptoms and trying to figure out who has what symptoms. This is really about, this is also going to be about economic stress and economic instability.
Well, the economic stress has been with us even before the Great Recession began, especially for certain groups, obviously disproportionate numbers of people in the Black, brown communities, certainly people from low-income communities and others. But it's important to understand that the health crisis that is a result of the pandemic is going to fuel an economic crisis of even higher significance. And people are already talking about great depressions of unemployment are going to simply get worse as time goes on. And so the priority really needs to be study of the spread of this disease so that we can then address the economic impact that the COVID-19 pandemic is having on some people around the country.
So we have made the decision rather late to sort of shut down work as we know it, different types of work. What are the long-term ramifications of that? Can we recover from this?
Well, as a medical sociologist, and again, I'm someone who studies and investigates the determinants of health. I have to look at the health impact first as a predictor of the economic malaise that we will continue to find ourselves. The federal government response is inept, and it is because of that response that we're seeing the number of cases spike, and to see that spike, and as a result of that, we're going to continue to see more people die, unfortunately. But unless we really get a firm handle on how we can identify cases where people are positive for COVID-19 and then begin to produce protocols or processes by which we can stem the tide that are based on population-specific processes, it's going to get worse and worse. And so this year, Memorial Day could not have come at a worse time. And I say that because there are certain states around the country that have begun to open up again. We've begun to see more and more people congregating in close proximity, not wearing face masks, not practicing social distancing. And what this is going to do, as we have just begun to get a handle on stemming the rise of cases of COVID-19, it's going to spark a new surge. And unfortunately, when you see a reigniting of surges of this kind, it creates infection and it also creates more death where there doesn't need to be. But that is especially profound within certain communities. When you look at the data, disproportionate numbers of Black people around the country and including New Haven have been affected by COVID-19, whether it's through infection or through deaths. One of the things that we also have to look at is the complexity of understanding why these rates are spiking in certain communities as opposed to others. And so before we can talk about reopening the country as it relates to an economic reinvigoration, we have to first get a handle on what we're dealing with. And
So,
one of the things that
Dr. Brown, were you now, as we were paying attention, can you hear me all right? As we were paying attention to people are discovering the inequities and health disparity between people, Black people and brown people. And you would have thought that this was the first time people were actually hearing this information. How did you feel some kind of way when people started wanting to talk about this in ways as if it just showed up yesterday?
in some ways it was alarming. And what's important for your listeners to understand is that the federal government had been anticipating a pandemic of this kind going back to the early 2000s. In fact, we really began to hear conversation about it during the George W. Bush administration, going back to 2005. We certainly heard this occur during the Obama administrations, those 8 years. And in fact, the Obama administration created what was called the Pandemic Response Team. The current administration disbanded the Pandemic Response Team. So it made the federal government's response to this emerging pandemic quite anemic. But many people are basing the information that they use to make decisions in their lives off of outlets like social media. And so it's really important to be sure that you're getting your information from a reliable source. You want to go to state health departments. The state departments of health are a trusted source. You want to go to entities like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC website, cdc.org, and you have to resist the temptation to take in information that you may be hearing from some social media outlets. Not all of them are unuseful, but we've got to be very careful that we're listening to folk who have our best interests at heart and who do not have necessarily a political agenda. And what's really important now is that we continue to practice social distancing. We continue to wear face masks when we go out. We continue to wash our hands as often as we can. We continue to resist the temptation to touch our faces because our hands can often have bacteria or particles, germs that can be introduced to our body that can make us sick. Mm-hmm. And I know too, one of the issues that you'll find, especially in some communities, is it may not be possible to practice social distancing because you may live in a 2-bedroom home or apartment with 6 or 7 people. And so we have to understand that there are nuances to these directives that we're giving people. But the idea of going out to party, and to congregate, to play basketball, to play soccer is simply not a good idea. And so one of the questions that I pose to people is this: do you want to the pandemic of 2020, or do you want to be remembered? It's really a simple question.
Wow.
So look at this in terms of surviving this pandemic, because we want to be able to look back at this time and say, well, these are the things that we did. There were great sacrifices, to be sure, but we had to do these things in order to preserve our health and ultimately to preserve our lives.
So, Dr. Brown, how do we as Black people, Black and brown people, that we have so many of us have pre-existing conditions? You know, we have high incidences of diabetes and high blood pressure and all other kinds of illnesses that seem to be attractive to this COVID-19. we are disproportionately affected and affected by this virus. How do we address this in the face of an administration that is at odds with the very medical professions that sort of help us? You know, the White House is not respecting the CDC, is not respecting the National Health Institute, is not, you know, we have a president who is saying, I'm taking drugs that are not deemed appropriate. So how do we decipher and maneuver these waters?
Well,
I know
looking
that's
at
a lot.
community, we have to keep that it's an incredibly diverse and varied community of people. We do know that in some Black, there are disproportionately higher rates of things like asthma, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, and the like. And so with these existing health challenges, and in the public health space, we call these comorbidities, it can increase the likelihood that some people with these health challenges may be more susceptible to becoming infected. And so it's really important to understand the ways in which the disease spreads. Now, COVID-19 is related to SARS, and we recall that there was an outbreak of SARS in 2003. Mm-hmm. The thing about COVID-19 is that it is an airborne disease. It travels through the air. And the example I use is, let's say, for example, that you are walking to the store, and hopefully you're wearing a mask as you walk to the store. But a couple of minutes earlier, a person may have been walking down that same street, same side of the street, and they cough or sneeze, they don't cover their mouth. They happen to be positive for COVID-19, but they don't realize it because they have not been able to get tested, but they're also not showing any symptoms of the virus. The particles of that sneeze are now in the air floating with COVID-19. You walk by, the particles land on your face. You don't know this, of course, and you happen to rub your eye with your finger, or you scratch your nose. And what you may have just done was introduce the virus into your body. And so with airborne diseases, those are the most, I'll say, dangerous because we can't see it. Another way to look at it is, think of those times that you may be in your home and sunlight is passing through your window. And because sunlight is present, you can see dust particles in the air. Well, that's the same way that the virus moves. Even when we can't see it, the particles may be there. And so this is why it's so important to remain indoors as much as you can, to resist temptation to go to cookouts and to congregate with friends, because we simply don't have any immunity to this disease, which makes everyone susceptible. Everyone, doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter where you live. But people who have existing health challenges can be more susceptible. Mm-hmm. Another population that can be particularly vulnerable to COVID-19 are seniors, because obviously as we get older, our immune systems are not as strong as they once were. And so the idea of practicing social distancing as much as you can, wearing face masks, and resisting the temptation to touch your face are things that you as an individual can do. And in addition to, or some would argue, in spite of the federal government may be saying. Now we have a sitting president who we've never seen wear a face mask, never. And so for millions of people around the country, attitude reflects leadership. But in this instance, it's incredibly important to follow the guidelines that are being set forth by your state health department and err on the side of being overcautious than not cautious enough. Because again, we want all of your listeners to be able to talk about the pandemic of 2020 a year from now than to again be remembered. The other thing is that with disproportionate numbers of Black people, we are forced to have to go to work because disproportionately, we work low-wage jobs. And when I say low wage, I'm talking about those jobs that pay $15 or less an hour. We don't have the ability to work from home. We don't have sick leave. We don't have vacation pay. And so far too many of us are having to make some absolutely horrible decisions about If I don't go to work, I don't get paid. If I don't get paid, I can't put food on the table. And individuals may already be struggling to do just that, to keep a roof over their heads. And so we should be instituting policies and practices that will keep workers from being forced to make those kinds of decisions. Mm-hmm. But we know, unfortunately, that too many of the folk in our community can't say no. They have to get on 2 or 3 buses one way just to get to work. They have to interact with clients without any protective equipment, without gloves, without a shield. They do these things in order to continue to try to put food on their table to take care of their families. And we have to, as has been said in the past, become the leaders that we see. We cannot rely on others to do for us what we need to be doing for ourselves. And that means taking ownership for our personal well-being. That means taking ownership for the well-being of the people in our families, and also taking some ownership for the people who live in our communities. Because if we can begin to do that, and I'd like to add too that we also need to infuse these approaches with that good old common sense that our grandmothers and great-grandmothers had, and grandfathers and great-grandfathers had. Just good old-fashioned common sense. But what we continue to see is that common sense is not common, is it? But we have to reinfuse these things so that it puts us in a position where we can manage the extent that we may be exposed to this disease and hopefully ward off any kind of infection.
So as a medical sociologist, I would imagine that you sort of look back through history to see similar references that could address or speak to how we should behave and move forward during this pandemic. People talk about the influenza of the 1800s, right? It was the 1800s.
No, it was a pandemic of 1918.
1918.
Yes.
The pandemic of 1918. And we've had other diseases. You know, we've had smallpox, I believe. We've had all kinds of other things. And with each health crises, we've learned something. What do you think the takeaway will be from this? Because I get the sense, Dr. Brown, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist at all, but I just believe that once we start introducing the word pandemic, once we have this, that there's a good chance that this will come back around again and again and again.
Oh, it could, but the good news is, from a scientific point of view, we have more knowledge than we ever have. And so that's a great thing. So the body of knowledge that we have been able to acquire from the pandemic of 1918 through the outbreak of smallpox, tuberculosis, even through as recently as the swine flu of 2009. We have a body of information that gives us far greater insight, not just in terms of how to address an emerging pandemic, but what we can do in a proactive manner to keep diseases from becoming epidemics and pandemics. But it requires leadership at the federal and state levels that are of one mind. It requires bringing all of our resources to bear, which means that we cannot indulge in an anti-intellectual pursuit. We have to bring our experts to the table. We have to listen to what the experts are saying. We have to trust that these folk, a cadre of dedicated people from a variety of disciplines, are simply doing their work in the best interest of their country. You know, one of the things that you will hear during the inaugural address is that the sitting commander-in-chief is duty-bound to protect the country from enemies foreign and domestic. And so if we look at this from a case study perspective, there were just a litany of errors that were made that could have been avoided. We have been getting warning indicators based on the scientific evidence for years that a pandemic was going to. So this is not a surprise. We have known this for a long time. And so what my hope is that the powers that be will allow the experts, will allow the seasoned veterans, will allow those with the requisite levels of cultural empathy to understand the hardships and challenges that are being brought upon a variety of populations, will be allowed to do their work so that we can truly get a handle on this. Because remember now, a vaccine for COVID-19 is not going to happen for a while. And you may have talked obviously about a vaccine coming as early as the end of the year. But when we think about it, the gestation period for the development of a vaccine, a viable vaccine, takes years. Now, if one could be produced by the end of the year, that would be outstanding. But the likelihood that it will happen is quite remote. And so we have to use the existing body of knowledge that we have before us so that it helps to inform our understanding about the process by which COVID-19 spreads, the potential mutations of ours, and the ways in which it affects a variety of populations around the country. Keeping in mind that those who are exposed to things such as structural racism, those who are economically disenfranchised, those who are forced to work on the front lines because their jobs have told them, if you do not come to work, you will be fired. We also have to keep in mind that these are the folks who represent some of the most vulnerable communities in the entire country. So the bigger question is, why will we put our most vulnerable people in harm's way knowingly? Why would we do that?
Because the economic driver, because you hear these corporations say, this affects our bottom line. And if we can't have the bodies at work, then we are not able to provide the jobs that make the country go. That's the argument.
Well, that's the argument, but let me take that a bit further. And that is because these economic drivers are driven by the indifference to the exposure to this disease of Black people and brown people. And so we need to have that conversation. One of the things that's really incredible to me is that, it had been said some months ago, given the policies of the administration, that this is, again, an opportunity for America to face itself, to face its past. And what I'm talking about is the genocide of the indigenous people. I'm talking about the enslavement of Africans of African descent for 246 years and 3 months. I'm talking about the internment of Asians at the beginning of the 20th century. And so it's been argued that now we can really begin to look at ourselves for who we are and deal with it honestly and openly, and then move forward in a productive way so that all of this nation's members can live out the true meaning of what this society is supposed to offer. But we have not seen that happen. And I think that past, unfortunately, will continue to be prologue, which is again why I say we have to be the leaders that we seek. We cannot placate the responsibility of our own health and well-being on other parties. We have to make sure that we are doing these things for ourselves, which means we have to make alliances with people. We have to love ourselves again. We have to work for the good of the greater majority rather than simply for ourselves. And I think we also, in doing these types of things, set a more proper example for our young people, because they're one of the particular groups that is being affected in some very, very significant ways. I had the opportunity to teach a course at one of the colleges in New Haven this semester, and it was actually a college course for AP high school students. And so we went from obviously face-to-face class time to having really essentially working on Zoom, having the class on Google Classroom. But before each class started, I would do kind of a check-in, just a quick check-in with every student to see how they were doing. And I think that we have to consider the impact of this pandemic on a number of groups, but especially young people. They didn't sign up for this. They have not been prepared to see their lives completely turned upside down, be in a constant level of fear and anxiety about the future will hold. And so when you see people who are protesting with brandishing weapons, that their civil liberties and freedoms are being infringed upon, but we're seeing people dying every day because of this virus. What kind of message are we sending to young people? And more importantly, what kind of country do we want to be? And last, the idea is to make the country a bit better than it was. We don't want to hand off a country to the next generation
Right.
that's worse shape than when we got here. And so all of these things are part of discussions that we should be having in our families, in our communities, in our places of worship, with our policymakers, with our community leaders, with our police officers. These are the kinds of conversations that we're going to have on our own, because
I think you're right, Dr. Brown, but look how long it took the church community, the religious community to come around. You know, it wasn't an immediate, okay, we're gonna virtually have church. It took a lot of wrestling with them to get them to even shut their doors and not have people come to church on Sundays and Bible study on Wednesdays and whatever else that happens during the week.
well,
It took so long.
some did. I'll say something about that, and I mean no disrespect, but as it says, faith without works is dead. And so we simply can't rely on the Creator to do for us what we need to do for ourselves. Because one of the things that each of us is imbued with is the power of choice. And so this is the time that we have to get access to the best information that is available so that it informs our understanding, which then facilitates our ability to make the best choices possible. And I realize that for many people, the choices are very, very limited. And this is why we need a response that starts in families, works up to the community and grassroots levels, and ultimately gets to the policy level. Because the longer we have to address new cases of the virus, the longer it's going to take for the economy to rebound. And this is why I said at the top of the show, until we really understand that our first priority is to address the health crisis and not the economy, the longer it's going to take for the economy to be resuscitated.
Mm-hmm. So do you think testing is the way to go? To continually test and try to get a baseline for who has it and who doesn't, and to really sort of, you know, because right now in New Haven, they've identified hotspots of where it's the hardest hit, you know, and now they're just starting to open up places where people can just walk in without having insurance, without having to get prescriptions, without having to do all the hoops that you initially had to jump through.
But the problem is, because we have not had enough tests, we are consistently undercounting the numbers of people who are infected. And remember now, a person can be asymptomatic, in other words, have no visible symptoms and be positive. And so unless we can contain the spread of the virus by limiting our exposure to each other, by continuing to wear masks, by practicing social distancing, it's going to be hard to really determine the true prevalence or the true number of cases of people who are positive for this disease. Because just as we begin to get a handle on the spread, as soon as we begin to contain the spread of the virus, we are simultaneously opening up places of business. So it's like we continue to return to the scene of the crime. And so unless we're able to have people understand the importance of being in a lockdown situation, and I understand it's warm now, and some have argued, well, you know, because it's getting hot, that's going to kill the virus, but it doesn't stop necessarily person-to-person contact and interaction, which is the way in which the virus is transmitted. And so let's say, for example, you're outside at a restaurant and one person sneezes, doesn't cover up, as I said a few moments ago. The wind, the breeze takes that virus and it spreads it to maybe 10 or 15 people who don't even realize it. This is why it's so important to stay as far away from people as you can. Now, obviously, people in your family, that's a different matter. You may not be able to do that, obviously. But the other thing,
that's a very hard thing.
But a very, very, very hard thing to do. Now, at a little levity, and it's not really funny, you know, you've got a lot of people in place who are sick of one another now. Like, I've never spent so much time with my family members. I didn't realize how much I don't like you, and that's kind of tongue in cheek. But you have to be smart. It's like, just again, just think about the bigger picture. Mm-hmm. You know, we have to continue to advocate and fight on behalf of those who tend to have no voice. And I'm talking again about folk who are in poor communities, certainly seniors. And we also have to look in terms of the in which we can try to, because of what we've had to do over the last several months, alleviate the stress. Now, one of the other things that has emerged too are the spikes in levels of anxiety, depression, and overall mental health challenges.
Yeah.
We talk about the impact of stress, and stress is with us all the time, but we can typically manage it. But now we're in situations where you may come from a family where there is abuse in that home, but because of the practices that we're being asked to follow, staying at home, practicing social distancing, you may be in harm all of the time now because you're in the very environment that is the cause of so much of your dysfunction. And so that's another dimension to this. So when I said that this is a very complex issue, this is what I'm talking about. And so we know things like family violence. We know things like the emotional abuse, the physical abuse, the sexual abuse can run rampant in times like these. And so it's really important to have ways of being able to address these issues in as positive a manner as possible. And this is what can make especially children and even smaller ones as particularly vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And so if you may be in a situation where you've noticed that there are changes in the overall demeanor of a child or a young person, that may be the time to just ask some questions. Well, how are things going? You know, how are you feeling about this? And when you listen to the response of that child or young person, listen to what they are saying, but also listen to what they're not. Because sometimes what a person doesn't say will give you far more insights to what's going on when they actually say something. Mm-hmm. So these are some of the nuances that we have to consider during this time. And I think having conversations like this in communities, all people understand, okay, this isn't just happening. This is something that may be far more common than I realize. And in so doing, it could help to give a voice to a person who may, under different circumstances, may feel uncomfortable saying anything.
Mm-hmm. The schools, I think, moved rather quickly in shutting down facilities and not having children come back to school, and just not come back not even thinking about this again into the fall, right? So although summer schools may find themselves open because parents have to go back to work, like we said earlier, and children will have to be someplace safe. They cannot be left alone. And so this feels very much like a catch-22, Dr. Brown. You know, people have to go to work. They can't not go to work. Kids have to go to school at some point. I feel like people are starting to feel like they are feeling trapped and there's no way out, and rent is due, and mortgages are due, and tuition is due, and people are feeling overwhelmed as you go to the grocery store, and it feels very dystopian, you know, which is not something that Americans are used to feeling. You know, we are used to abundance.
Yeah. And those feelings are very valid. And this is why the federal government and states have an obligation to ensure that it's doing all it can to protect its citizens. I think that there will need to be a series of stimulus packages going forward for families and communities. I think that it will be unrealistic to think that this first wave of stimulus checks is going to get the job done. Because I don't think, one, that life as we knew it will exist in the same way. The other thing is that when you look at the cost of living, when you look at how expensive it is to live in a state like Connecticut, there is no way that $1,200 is going to meet those expenses. And I also think that, one of the things that we haven't talked about, Babz, is the gig economy. And there's another thing associated with the gig economy called future work, and it's this rapid deployment of technology, which has already been making some of the lower paying jobs obsolete. I think the workforce as presently know it is going to be reconstituted even further, which is to say that many of the jobs that were here prior to the beginning of the pandemic will no longer be available afterwards. And so as we see that there has been the reduction in the workforce, that is going to have a particularly devastating economic impact, again, on low-income communities and disproportionate numbers of people from communities of color. And so the idea of recalibrating in our heads what quality of living is going to be necessary. And that's going to be a very difficult thing, and that's probably another different show to wrap your head around. And so the idea of becoming entrepreneurs is going to carry more weight than it ever has in our lifetime. So the idea of going back to work, eventually the country is going to have to reopen, but we're going to have to do that in a very careful way, because if we do not, it is going to spawn the resurgence of this virus.
And the doctors are already saying, let's be prepared for the second wave.
Well, I submit that you will start to see it right after this holiday.
Oh boy.
Because the beaches have been open. Mm-hmm. The restaurants have been open. People have been cooped up for the last couple of months. Summer is upon us. Yes. And let's go out and have a good time and party. This is not the time for that. And I like to have a good time just as much as the next person. But I also have to consider the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is I and as many people as possible have to get beyond this time so that we can look back and understand it for what it was. We need to look at what was done well. We need to look at what was done poorly, and we need to do that in present tense so that we can make far better decisions. But the idea of saying that everything's fine, we're back online, is a recipe for disaster and death.
So since there is no cure, doctor, for COVID-19, that means it stays with us.
Well, now keep in mind now the coronavirus has been with us for a long time, but it's that this particular strain is novel or new. And when you hear the term novel, spelled N-O-V-E-L, like a book that you would read, novel means that we have no immunity to it. And that's what makes this particular strain of coronavirus especially problematic.
So do we think that if this is a different strain, will there be different strains coming?
Well, my best scientific answer is it depends. It depends on the rate at which we are able to develop a vaccine. It depends on the success of the vaccine. It depends on the deployment of the vaccine to a variety of different populations, but it also depends on the decisions we make as a species going forward. You know, as you've probably seen also, there have been places in the ozone that have magically closed up, that have been open for decades.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing how the earth has this amazing ability to heal itself.
Animals are repopulating.
Yes. And so maybe this is a moment where we could think about doing more by having a bit less.
Or maybe the earth is saying, I want you humans off of it so that I can.
Well, that's also a very valid point. You know,
I'd like the humans to get off the planet now.
yeah,
So that we can.
but we are supposed to be good stewards of this planet.
Well,
And
we
we're also
failed
supposed
that.
to be good stewards of one another. And so maybe this is an opportunity, I hope, where we can come together in ways that heretofore we have not.
Mhm.
But unless we heed the warnings of public health experts and others, it's going to be difficult to see a real end to this pandemic in this country, because so many of us here are used to doing things the way we want to do them, when we want to do them, for as long as we want to do them. And that type of thinking is simply not productive.
Yes. Wow. This has been a great conversation, Dr. Brown. Really eye-opening. I hope you can come back so that we can unpack some more of this, because I dare say we are in this for the long haul. And
Yes.
50 minutes is just not enough time. I'd really like to have a larger ongoing conversation and unpack these things piece by piece so that people really, I mean, because I think now, Dr. Brown, we are stuck in a bubble of it's all about the actual physical illness of this and not all the repercussions and the ramifications and the affect of this, you know.
Yeah, and as I said, this is a complex issue. You know,
It is.
especially when you look at the various populations that are involved.
Thank you so much. I want to have you come back and talk about this. Seriously.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that.
And Kathy Graves was absolutely right. You are a gem and knowledgeable and worth me chasing you down.
Yeah, I didn't know that a little mishap from last week. So
no. Like, we are all in this life together, and things happen. Let me tell you, believe me, I know better than anybody. So thank you. Have a good holiday if you can. Social distancing apart if you can. And Harry, we're on our way out. Thank you so much. Have a beautiful day.
Babz Rawls-Ivy from New Haven, Connecticut, and you're listening to WNHHLP 103.5 FM, streaming live at newhavenindependent.org.
Keep me moving till the morning light. Yeah. till the morning light. Wheels keep spinning, wheels keep spinning, wheels keep spinning till the morning light. Wheels keep spinning, wheels